History as it happens, May 10th, 2022. China's zero COVID fantasy.
Shanghai has reported its first 3 deaths from COVID-19 in its ongoing outbreak.
Confrontation between police and people being forced out of their homes.
A city of 25 million people been locked up in their homes since the end of March as a surge.
The result has been a food crisis, medical resources shortages, children separated from their parents, and economic disruption.
Under its powerful president Xi Jinping, China is still trying to eliminate the coronavirus, locking down Shanghai, imprisoning tens of millions of people. Yet COVID-19 will not go away, and Xi will not bend. Why not? People are suffering shortages. Lockdowns are damaging the economy. Yet Xi pursues his goal with a zeal reminiscent of ruinous campaigns of the Chinese past. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
During the Great Leap Forward was when Khrushchev just took office and he was undergoing the process of what's later called de-Stalinization. But Mao saw it as a deviation. And the Chinese version was the core, the real deal of communism. But the problem is that it's not going well. And we are sort of seeing the same thing coming up again in China, that you have a policy that's not working well, but you are politically too stubborn to correct the course.
Last summer, in front of a crowd of some 70,000 people in Tiananmen Square, Xi Jinping led the celebration marking the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party. He looked back at the party's history of struggle, and he looked ahead to Chinese power and greatness. The Chinese people will never allow any foreign forces to bully, oppress, or enslave us, Xi said. Whoever nurses delusions of doing that will crack their heads and spill blood on the Great Wall of Steel, built from the flesh and blood of 1.4 billion Chinese people. Well, Xi's problem today is not a foreign army. It's an invisible pathogen that pays no attention to political speeches. A few months later, in November, the party elevated Xi into the pantheon of China's historic leaders alongside Mao and Deng Xiaoping. Xi was praised for his outstanding leadership in the economy, foreign policy, and in containing COVID. And for a while, it looked like China was strongly emerging from the pandemic. But events have taken a dark turn. As I speak into this microphone in early May, the 26 million people of Shanghai have been locked down for weeks. And despite all the human misery and economic damage his policy has caused while not eliminating the virus, Xi is vowing to unswervingly, as state media puts it, stick with his plan. In other words, it doesn't look like anyone or anything will change his mind. So what is going on here? Is this another example of an autocrat blinded by his own power? Or is Xi afraid to reverse course because admitting error could damage his legitimacy in the eyes of party leadership? Remember, he's up for a 3rd term soon. Or does zero COVID fit into a larger pattern in Chinese history, Chinese communist history? Of fanatically pursuing a goal no matter the cost. All must bend to state power. Well, whenever I want to learn what's happening inside China, I invite Weifeng Zhong of the Mercatus Center to come on the podcast. He runs the Open Source Policy Change Index. That is a project that uses machine learning to read large volumes of Chinese propaganda to discern where communist policy may be going. Weifeng Zhong, welcome to the studio.
Thanks, Martin, for having me in person.
Yes, so much better than Zoom. Thank you for coming in. Normality is slowly returning, but not in the country of your birth. Just today, as you were on your way in, see a headline from CNBC.com, China Xi urges officials to resolutely fight those who question zero COVID policy. He is heading to a meeting of the country's top leaders, emphasizing that China should stick to its dynamic zero COVID policy, warning economic consequences would follow if it doesn't. Seems to me there are economic consequences for going through with this policy.
Absolutely. And I think that's the problem or the dilemma the Chinese leadership is in now. If you do not try to solve the pandemic problem, it hurts the economy. But when you try to solve it that way, it hurts the economy too. President Xi is at a very difficult corner now because of his strong control over the leadership in Beijing anyway. He has very low tolerance to disagreement. So that actually makes it even harder than the actual situation he's in.
This is what can happen with autocrats if they consolidate too much power. Then they don't want to listen to anybody, or in their immediate circle, all they have are yes men around them. This is what's been said is happening in the Kremlin with Putin. Is that happening in China? Do we even know?
Yeah, it's very hard to know what goes on behind closed doors now. And funny you ask that, because last year there was a story that came out from the New York Times. Apparently there was a cable from counterintelligence of officers at the CIA warning all the CIA stations around the world, saying that they have a lot of informants being killed or captured or compromised. So it's very hard even for the CIA to get people very close to key decision makers in China or in Russia for that matter. So it's very hard for even intelligence community to get accurate information of what goes on behind closed doors.
We have spent a good amount of time on the podcast. Our listeners know you've been with me a few times over Zoom discussing parallels between Xi and Mao. We'll try to get to some of those a little bit later. But it appeared China was emerging from the pandemic in pretty decent shape before this recent outbreak of the Omicron variant provoked the government to take this zero COVID approach. What was the inspiration for it? Because as I mentioned, it looked like China was emerging from the pandemic.
It was. In fact, I think the zero COVID policy really did have some success earlier on in the pandemic, because before the Omicron, or before Delta, I should say, the virus was not as transmissible as it is now. And so the economic cost and benefit calculation worked out better with a lockdown in the past in China. That's why we saw, especially before the Western world had wide access to effective vaccines, the Chinese economy was taking off or coming back faster or more robustly than, say, the U.S. economy. But of course, now we are totally flipped. The situation is totally flipped because the virus is much more transmissible, and it's very hard to contain the spread by locking people down. It did not work in Shanghai. It will not work in Beijing either.
As we're speaking here today, Shanghai has been locked down about 6 weeks. Population of Shanghai is what, 20, 30 million?
There are tens of millions of people.
Tens of millions of people. Beijing is totally locked down or partially?
Beijing has not started the total lockdown, but there are different ways to categorize the level of control. And if you look at the map, the area under more control is creeping in the center of Beijing. So it's getting worse and worse, and a lot of neighborhoods as well. So I think it might be coming up soon, although it's not entirely full lockdown yet.
And as you said, it's not really working very well. It is disrupting the economy globally because of the supply chain. A lot of industries have been shuttered for at least days or weeks in some cases. People are still catching the virus, even people who have been locked away in their apartment compounds. So if we know why is Xi still pursuing this strategy? I mean, it's easy to blame it on authoritarianism, but other countries, democratic countries, have taken really strict measures. New Zealand, Australia, for instance. So what's going on here?
I think President Xi might have been hooked on his own success, quote-unquote success, in controlling the spread earlier on with the zero COVID policy. And so the Shanghai lockdown was really the first faltering or a first failure of the zero COVID policy. So now that has failed so miserably, the problem for him is he cannot easily revert the policy because that would hurt his legitimacy or authority. And being just several months away from the party congress, if he admits to his own mistakes, it would hurt his credibility at the time when he was supposed to take on another 5-year term. So I think the political calculations is very much into this economic calculation here.
So it could potentially jeopardize his chances of being president again, or maybe not that far?
It's hard to say, but it would be very interesting to make the parallel. As you said, we like to make the comparison to history, was to look at Mao after the economic disaster of what's called the Great Leap Forward in late 50s and early 60s.
We're going to get to that, but go ahead, yeah.
So at the time, it was also a huge economic disaster. Mao actually temporarily stepped aside in terms of his control of the Chinese government. So it's possible that President Xi might have to step aside, although the damage to the economy now compared to the Great Leap Forward is minimal. So I'm not sure whether we are there yet.
Tens of millions of people starved to death during the Great Leap Forward, but this is causing huge disruptions to people's mental health. It's a good time, I think, now to discuss how authority does work in China. I mentioned the headline at the top of our conversation. Xi is meeting with the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee. He wants the country to unify behind this committee's decisions and, quote, resolutely fight against all questioning of virus control policies. That does sound something straight out of the Mao era. So if Xi is a dictator, maybe you don't agree with that label, how does authority work? What's his relationship to this committee? How important is it? Can it contravene him at this point?
Yeah, in China, it used to be what they call collective leadership. This is actually a good point to bring up the working of the Central Committee or the Politburo, which is even a smaller subset than the Central Committee. Because China used to have a collective leadership inside the party. Major decisions, including, for example, from central planning to market reforms, it was oftentimes voted on by the Politburo members, although they only have like 7 to 9 men. But there was some sort of a decision-making process that's collective, but not under President Xi. So the reason I found the story you cited very interesting too, because the fact that he came out to say that we have to curb dissent or disagreement, opposition to the policy, means that there are people disagreeing and there are people inside the party opposing the policy. It makes me wonder who he was referring to.
What do they mean by resolutely fight? There's obviously no free press, and if individual citizens speak out, they risk being persecuted. So what does he mean by that, resolutely fight?
So dissent could take the form of when you have party leadership meetings, some key party members would get the chance to speak, and some might choose to criticize the Chinese president. And if that happens, the people who are speaking out might be purged. Has happened many, many times over in Chinese history. The people who are speaking out usually are taking huge risk, even though they are the party elites.
And in this case, they might be right about the policy not working.
It doesn't matter, the fact that they're right.
Well, governments everywhere, not just in an authoritarian one-party system, often struggle to reverse course when a policy isn't working. One of my recent podcasts was about U.S. involvement in Vietnam. We saw how long it took for the U.S. to get out of that quagmire. Chinese history, we referenced the Great Leap Forward. It took tens of millions of people dying of starvation and the ruin of the economy, because Great Leap Forward was really about reorganizing the Chinese economy along the lines of small-scale industrialization, people putting like a small steel factory in their backyard. It took a while for them to finally reverse course, to say the least. How would Xi and the other leaders reverse course from this point? How would that work? What would that look like if it were to even happen?
I think it very much depends on how the Chinese economy goes for the rest of the year, or maybe into next year. And because the way I think now to understand the legitimacy of the Communist Party is to think with more focus on the economic success. Because in the Mao era, China had this ideology of communism, right? So the Great Leap Forward was a strategy, a very misinformed strategy to put the country in the path toward communism. So the communes people started living and all these, pots and pans that they melt together to make iron, for example, it's their way to achieve the collectivism.
Outside of the Soviet model, right? Mao did not want to go along the Soviet. He did not think that was the right way to...
Exactly. So that was the time. So during the Great Leap Forward was when Khrushchev just took office and he was undergoing the process of what's later called de-Stalinization. But Mao saw that as a deviation. And the Chinese version was the core, the real deal of communism. But the problem is that it's not going well. And we are sort of seeing the same thing coming up again in China, that you have a policy that's not working well, but you are politically too stubborn to correct the course.
Well, your work at Mercatus is to study Chinese government statements, state propaganda, to try to determine where policy might be going. So are you anticipating the government possibly sending any hints or indications in advance that they're going to end zero COVID? And then what? Put out a press release saying we're declaring victory and going home, zero COVID is over? How would it work?
It's entirely possible, actually. So earlier, we were talking about economic indications. In fact, if you think about the crackdown on technology companies, it's already being reverted to some extent, right? So late last year, it was cracking down on major tech firms like Alibaba. Now the Chinese government needs them because the economy is not working, right? And so they just change the talking points just like that when they have to revert the policy.
Was there any indication given, or did they just do it without signaling in advance that this was coming, or did it just happen?
It depends on whether the policy requires coordination in the society. So think about a policy where if you need to move a lot of money or resources from the eastern region of China to western region of China, something that, say, President Jiang Zemin in the past had done, that requires coordinating resources to move across country within China. And for things that you need the coordination from the people, you typically will have to tell them, explain to them why we are doing this. I've seen some of that in the tech crackdown or reverting the tech crackdown as well. And it would certainly be required for changing the zero COVID policy. Unfortunately, I have not seen any change in the talking points about how they approach COVID. Okay. So it hasn't happened yet.
I find the ways in which authoritarian governments function to be fascinating. I think a lot of people make a mistake when they believe that dictatorships or authoritarian forms of government don't need to pay heed to public opinion. Maybe at one point that was true. Classic authoritarian governments, right, would make sure the public was quiet. Does the Chinese government want a mobilized public? I suppose as long as it's preaching the party line, right? I mean, is Xi a populist in a sense?
He certainly is. And there are a lot of policy moves in China that obviously in the past have leveraged public coordination or public support. Anti-American sentiment, for example, requires a lot of public coordination, right? You have to coordinate the people to go to the U.S. embassy and throw eggs, for example, like at the time of high tensions, for example. So it doesn't take the form of voting. It doesn't take that form, but if people don't like certain policies, they can shirk, they can just not work, right? During the Great Leap Forward, because of the food was so scarce, people chose to not work just to conserve energy. So you don't get much out of people when your policy was so disastrous.
Is Xi popular? Is it even possible to measure that in a system like China?
Very hard. So there was no public opinion polling, good ones in China. Because, I mean, you can ask what they think about certain shampoo in Chinese residents. You can't ask them what they think about the Chinese leadership. So there's no real public opinion polling in China. But a metric I have looked at was actually how much the Chinese newspaper had to talk up President Xi. Because when he's not popular, we got to talk him up. So the fact that we are talking him up so much means that he's perhaps not as popular as in the past. But he has a very high baseline.
Well, the government has its own internal ways of measuring public opinion. They probably have lots of, might call spies, listening in on people's conversations in restaurants and bars, right? I mean, that's how the Gestapo did it and the SS did it in Nazi Germany.
The same thing, yeah. So if you look at how social media works in China, if you join, say, WeChat, which is the Chinese equivalent of, I don't know, Twitter and Facebook, if you are part of that group, and if you criticize Beijing, the Beijing government, you get censored. But you can criticize local governments. Oh. And so it's fine as long as you don't criticize Beijing, apparently, according to various political science research.
Is there initiative from below? Meaning if Shanghai's mayor decides, we can't keep doing this. This 6 weeks, it's a disaster. Can he initiate some change from below, or does it have to come from the top down?
At this day and age, I would say it has to come from the top down. No, it used to be that we still have a term called Shanghai gang or Shanghai faction, right, under former President Jiang Zemin or the people who used to work for him based in Shanghai. But it's not nearly as powerful as it used to be. The party head of Shanghai remained being part of the Politburo Standing Committee, the 7 most powerful men of the country, but he is in the minority. Even the Chinese premier remains in the minority, didn't get much airtime in propaganda, not nearly as much as President Xi himself.
Maybe he's regretting consolidating so much power because now he owns it, right?
Absolutely. You own all the responsibilities now.
I always find the use of language by authoritarian states, any government, to be so interesting, but especially in situations like these. A BBC article says the language of the battle against COVID has evolved. Whereas lockdown became known as static management in state-controlled media, the government has been forced, because the policy is really not working, to shift its goal to what it calls societal zero. That is, no positive cases emerging outside controlled quarantine areas. I wonder if when people, regular people, ordinary citizens see these things, they roll their eyes. So what purpose do these statements serve?
Absolutely. And it doesn't make sense. Like if you are controlling certain neighborhoods, how can you expect no cases outside of the area you control? It doesn't make sense at all. But I think the majority of the people under lockdown in China are having the same frustration. The problem with local opposition you mentioned, we don't see as much now in China, whether it's local officials or just ordinary citizens in Shanghai. If you look at some interviews by local officials, they will come out, the first thing they would say would be to say that we are just following the command from Beijing. It's what we are supposed to do. We stand absolutely behind President Xi's command.
Would you say he's a dictator at this point?
I would say so, yeah. Now, if you look at what the local officials say, they, on the surface, look like they are supporting President Xi, but it's the indirect way of saying that it's not our fault, blame Beijing, not us, for the lockdown.
What's the enforcement mechanism to impose the will of a single man on a country as large as China? China's got an enormous population. It's geographically large and diverse. How do they make everyone fall in line? They must not be able to get everybody to do what they want, right?
Yeah, so if you compare that with the China before the economic reform, before the reform, the legitimacy comes from the ideology of communism.
Yes.
There was this great vision that it's not achievable, but there was this great vision for the country when people produce things together. Now, after the reform, the ideology was not there.
After the success of the market reforms that started in the 80s, that kind of eroded the legitimacy of communist ideology in the minds of people. They were less enthusiastic about it.
Yeah, that's what I meant. So
Okay.
the legitimacy problem shifted toward economic success. So now leadership in Beijing had to clear a much higher bar for economic success to justify the fact that they're in power. Whereas under the Mao era, because you have such a great ideology, maybe temporarily you could still tolerate an economic disaster. Now, not so much anymore. So the pressure put on President Xi would be that if the GDP goes way below 5%, for example, that would mean absolute disaster for the leadership in Beijing. Whereas in the Mao era, that meant tens of millions of people dying or starving to death.
Obviously, the government's not going to go anywhere, but there could be some internal shuffling, potentially someone else coming to power, shunting aside Xi Jinping, despite all the power that he has now. I mean, it's happened in the past, right? You said Mao even had to step aside at one point.
Exactly. So that's why I think President Xi is somebody who has studied Mao very intensely. He understands all the history.
Sorry, we've discussed that.
He understands how Mao lost power. My conjecture, I don't know what goes on in his mind, my conjecture is that he would take measures to prevent that from happening. The way Mao lost power was when there was this big conference meeting with 7,000 cadres to discuss the economic situation. And then the number 2 most powerful person in the Chinese government at the time spoke out first to say, let's talk about the situation in the economy. It's not doing well. People are starving. We need to change that. After that person spoke out, everybody else started to speak out. And that's what prompted Mao to, in that kind of relatively more open forum, to force Mao to have to take responsibilities.
It's amazing that during Mao's time, there was even more openness during that period than there is today.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on, for example, we don't know how large the meetings will be, but what we know is that there will be the party congress coming up, right, in the fall. We don't know exactly when it's going to happen, because sometimes Beijing would delay meetings if they have unresolved problems. Now, this COVID crisis now will be an unresolved problem come fall when they were supposed to have the party congress meeting. So would he delay the meeting? Well, I think that would be an indication of how nervous he is in terms of losing grip of the power, because you don't want to start a meeting without resolving these issues and let people criticize you.
He does seem to be like in a room we're in right now, a windowless room where he can't see out.
But from the reverting of the tech crackdown policy from last year that's happening now, because Beijing needs them, shows that it still has some flexibility.
That's good.
So I do not rule out the possibility that, maybe weeks down the road, they would say that zero COVID is really not working. Now we really started to understand Omicron, so let's abandon it. It's entirely possible.
One would hope, for the sake of the people who are stuck in their apartments and still catching the virus anyway, which is amazing. I mentioned before that even democratically elected governments can make really bad mistakes and take a long time to reverse course, even with a lot of public opinion, a lot of public input. I referenced the U.S. and Vietnam. Max Hastings, great military historian, was on the podcast a few weeks ago, and he brought up this idea of Every nation has its own logics. I do think we have to be careful if we generalizing say that this is a Chinese issue or there's something about the Chinese character or the way they do government there. But do you think there's something to that every nation has its own logics? And in China, based on what we know about its history, these types of campaigns are not unusual.
It is not unusual, and there's this sense of righteousness that you can see from the Chinese president, and we can compare him to Mao, for example. Mao's righteousness was that he saw he was the real heir of communism after Stalin because Khrushchev was not doing the right thing. That's why he started the Great Leap Forward. Once you understand it, you understand everything that followed, including the Cultural Revolution, because that was really his revenge, right? People who took power away from him. So he came back to purge them. That's what the Cultural Revolution was all about. The righteousness with the current Chinese leadership was that they saw the zero COVID as a success to some extent earlier on. So now they're adhering to it because that used to work. They still believe it's like you buy a stock and it's going down, but you refuse to sell. It happens to everybody.
And buy more and more shares of it while it's tumbling. So then fundamentally, this is about ideological fanaticism, ideological rigidity, and pure power. I mean, we are talking about using the force of government to keep millions of people essentially imprisoned in their homes.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you said earlier that the drawback of accumulating too much power is that at the time of crises, you don't get good advice. Because people are not supposed to give good advice.
Afraid to contradict you, right?
Exactly. So I think that's the main problem now. And being so close to the Party Congress, I'm really concerned for how the Chinese economy will be going because it doesn't look like it's very easy to change course. But then we still have to tolerate at least a few more months until the Party Congress happens.
Let's talk a little bit about the Great Leap Forward, which was followed by the Cultural Revolution. Great Leap Forward was about economics. The Cultural Revolution was about consolidating or reshuffling the leadership of the party to preserve the communist revolution. Do you agree with that general framing?
To some extent.
You can disagree all you'd like, Weifeng. Go ahead.
Yeah, to some extent. But the way I see Cultural Revolution was that was really just Mao's personal revenge of the people who opposed him for the disastrous economic policy during the Great Leap Forward. The number 2 guy under Mao, his name is Liu Shaoqi. He was the Chinese president at the time when Mao was the party chairman. The title is not there anymore. Instead, now President Xi is the general secretary of the Communist Party. But Mao at the time was party chairman, but under him there was this Chinese president. He spoke out criticizing Mao, and Mao had to basically step aside. He still had an honorary title, but he was not doing the day-to-day management of the economy for a few years. So the Cultural Revolution was Mao coming back and revenge against the people who opposed him earlier on.
There's also some ideological implications, though, right? I mean, they had these red guards who were there attacking, traditional Chinese values and also bourgeois things. What was the point of all that? To purify the party?
That's the talking point. I think it's unclear whether the entire Cultural Revolution was being overplayed compared to what Mao intended. Because this is not rare. Like he sometimes had policies that sort of overachieve or overshooting. Compared to
he was not afraid to press the gas pedal on the fanaticism.
Right. So he had
the radicalism.
Right. So there was the time he wanted the intellectuals to come speak out, and that's right before the Great Leap Forward. They came out and criticized the government. And that's overshooting compared to what he wanted. So he just shut them down and purged them and put them in jail. There are errors everywhere in that era.
Deng Xiaoping was set to the side too, right? He was purged.
During the few years when Mao was stepping aside, not doing the day-to-day management, Deng Xiaoping was actually one of the few key people who are running the country.
We've discussed this before, but I'll bring it up again because not everybody listens to every single episode. As a child, what did you learn about the Great Leap Forward? I'm assuming you did not learn the truth.
No, so I learned about that much later on after I left China. The same with pretty much a lot of other things. I had to come to learn about them after I left this heavily controlled information environment. The Great Leap Forward, however, I was raised during the first decade of the reform era when China was relatively freer, you would say. Even if you look at the Soviet Union, after Stalin died, there was also this great period of thaw, right? I think some people call it the Khrushchev's thaw, where some people are allowed to at least speak out a little bit. I was raised in that period, so I did learn that the Great Leap Forward was a disaster. It was not working. But the history books did not go as far into criticizing Mao as they should.
Why has Mao made a comeback of sorts? He's not entirely discredited anymore. Xi Jinping held that enormous public gathering with a poster of Mao. Mao Zedong is widely believed to have been one of the worst tyrants of the 20th century.
I think many people also in China also came to learn at least some aspect of that, especially when the information environment was freer in the 1980s, for example, right, leading up to June 4th, 1989 Tiananmen Square protests and crackdown. Up to that point, I think younger generation in China was a little bit more informed, so they knew about that. Talking so much about Mao now, I think the motivation could be to say that, one could make a huge mistake yet remain in power. And that's why we glorify Mao.
He was a state builder, right? They could say he was a state builder. I mean, he is the most important individual in modern Chinese history.
That's exactly why when last year there was this history resolution, President Xi came back with this theory that sort of unified the Chinese history all the way back to the end of the Imperial China when China was invaded by many other countries, particularly Japan. So he said, we had all this humiliation, 100 years of humiliation. That's the national identity because it doesn't have communism anymore. It needs something, nationalism or the national identity from this humiliation was where he went for.
Well, I have to remember the way China was exploited by other countries, Japan, the West, the spheres of influence in the early 20th century. That history does still matter.
I guess it matters in different way to different people. If you look at the experience of modern China's founding father, Sun Yat-sen, who was the founding father of the Republic of China, which is now in Taiwan, he would say, if you ask him, he would say that, his influence of seeing all these consequences of invasion when he went to Hong Kong, which was a British colony, he was actually so impressed by how clean the street was, how not corrupt the Hong Kong government was, right? Actually, that's where he first learned about the concept of liberty and good government. That's where...
In a British colony.
In a British colony. And many Chinese revolutionaries, when they went to Shanghai in the regions, areas occupied by Western countries, they also saw a very clean street and being so impressed about it. And so they said, we want this for the rest of China too, because it looks pretty good.
I suppose we can wrap up with this. Because the way the Soviet Union collapsed from within, it folded on its own reforms, right? There was a flourishing of dissent and liberal thought in the late stages of the Soviet Union because of Gorbachev reforms. But Gorbachev decided not to use state power, state force to clamp down and save the system. This is around the same time the Chinese cracked down on Tiananmen Square. The lesson they learned from the collapse of the Soviet Union is that you don't release your grip. And I think that's probably still the attitude today. I mean, I don't know that much about Xi Jinping, but it seems to me that he came of age during this period, and that's the lesson that he learned from it.
Actually, more than just him, all Chinese leaders learned the lessons from the fall of the Soviet Union to say that we cannot lose our grip. And that's why, if you look at the policy in terms of social control, it has been very consistent since 2 Chinese presidents ago. Even during the early years of the internet in early 2000s, when people in China had a little bit more access to information, China started to meddle with the information flow on the internet. They started to control what kind of fora people could have at universities, for example. When I went to college, I used to be able to go on a forum, for example, at the Peking University and just check out what kids over there are talking about. And that's different from the kids at my school were talking about, briefly, until it was shut down. So
can't do that anymore then.
Soon after, I think in the first or second year when I went to college, you could only see your internal, the university forum. You cannot see any other university forums outside.
That tells me there's an insecurity there within government power circles. They're afraid, in a way. It seems that that marks the relationship with other countries, Chinese international relations. They approach the relationships with almost a sense of paranoia or pride. They don't want to be taken advantage of.
I think that's a correct assessment, but I would say that it's actually broader than just authoritarian countries. Even if you look at democracies, the entire human society now, after the internet, elites are losing grip of their influence. They were not as influential anymore as they used to be in the past. Some social media accounts could be way more influential than certain people in key offices in governments, even in democratic governments.
I should probably know the answer to this question. By the way, I said we were wrapping up, but I guess not. I should probably know the answer to this question. Can somebody in anywhere in China, let's just say Beijing or Shanghai, go online and read the New York Times?
No.
And they can watch Western movies, but probably movies that paint China in a negative light are not shown in China.
Correct.
If there are any. I mean, Hollywood doesn't do that because they don't want to lose the Chinese market.
The New York Times got into this problem when they had this big story about the former Chinese premier Wen Jiabao had a lot of corrupt dealings, or his wife had a lot of corrupt dealings, and this distinction without much difference. And after they published the big story, the Chinese was not happy about it, and they shut New York Times down. But in fact, if you look at all the major newspapers, though, like Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, none of that is available in openly accessible to Chinese residents. In fact, when I was growing up, there's this thing, even when you go on search certain things on Baidu, which is China's version of Google, if you type, for example, Taiwan independence, it will not show any result. It will say your internet is not working.
Do ordinary Chinese believe what they read in the state-controlled media?
I think the majority of them do. One datum or data point that I have was my own experience that when I went for graduate school in Hong Kong in 2006, that's right after I finished college, that was the time I learned about Tiananmen Square massacre.
In 2006?
Something that happened 17 years ago. I only learned about that in when I got to Hong Kong. I saw there was this bloody red sculpture in Hong Kong showing a lot of dead bodies piling up, very disturbing, on the campus of the University of Hong Kong. I went there and I said, what is this eyesore, right? So I looked at it. And it says to commemorate the Tiananmen Square massacre. So I said, what massacre? I don't think anybody died in Tiananmen Square. That's when I learned. Of course, it's so painful to learn that after such a long delay, right? So I thought I was, informed when I was in China. So my understanding is that a lot of people in China are like me, that they don't understand the full scale of especially atrocities. If you ask people whether they knew about forced labor camps in Xinjiang, most of them would not know.
Wow. I mean, Americans have their own issues with not knowing their history, but you can go into a library and read hundreds upon hundreds of books about American slavery or the treatment of Native Americans. The information's available. People just don't always know it. It's a different situation where the information's not even available.
Absolutely.
It's not that everything the Chinese state media says is abjectly false. I'm sure that they have mundane press releases, if you will, that just state basic things, right?
Yeah. So it's not entirely falsehood, but whether it's falsehood or truth was not the point, I think, about propaganda. The point about propaganda, analyzing it, was to gauge from what's said to what the intention of the Chinese government is. The Chinese government spends hundreds of millions of dollars on its own propaganda department. It was actually literally called propaganda department until they realized that propaganda is not a good word. We know it's not a good word. They perhaps did not. So they changed it to publicity department. But the budget for that department was about hundreds of millions of dollars every year. It's foolish, in my view, to not think about what those words mean when they are so carefully chosen. What those words tell us about Beijing, I think this is the analysis of propaganda that's so undervalued.
It's interesting, yeah, if they're spending that much money on it, right? Xi Jinping is 68 years old. He's been president for 10 years. And do you foresee him possibly being there 10 or 15? Things can change quickly in politics. Maybe not in Chinese politics, but maybe so.
Maybe so as well. I think the way the COVID pandemic is being handled now, I think adds a lot more uncertainties to the questions than what I used to believe. I used to believe that he will be at least in power for another 10 years, if not longer. I don't know now. I'm not sure now. It depends on how the rest of the year goes before the party congress.
Well, what's interesting is Donald Trump, in my view, primarily lost his re-election bid because of the way he approached the pandemic in a very callous and, in my view, incompetent manner. The way China handled the pandemic in the very early stages was utterly disgraceful, right? They persecuted the doctor he wound up dying. They persecuted the doctor who made the discovery or tried to get the word out. They've never been honest about the origins of COVID with the world, allowing outside investigators in. What penalty has Xi Jinping paid for that?
I certainly agree with what you said. In fact, now you can't even say the people got arrested after the doctor was so sad an example. But more recently, right before the Shanghai lockdown, there were 2 men who were arrested for predicting that Shanghai would go into a lockdown.
They got it right and they got arrested anyway.
So that's why, I appreciate so much, I love talking about history with you on the show. And I appreciate so much the freedom we have now to even just make predictions, right? We just did on the show, I think, to predict that Beijing might go into lockdown. We won't be put in jail in this country for making predictions of that sort. So I think the closely controlled information environment is really a big problem for China. And it's even sometimes the Chinese authorities are even overdose on its own misinformation.
So they poison themselves with lies, is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Weifeng Zhong of the Mercatus Center, you are always welcome here. On the next episode of History as It Happens, free speech, the right to speak your mind, produce art, develop a controversial academic theory without fear of retribution is supposed to be a bedrock American legal and cultural value. So why do we seem to be losing it? Our free speech wars, next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.